And our guest this evening is the critic, Jim Hoberman. He is the author of the new book, Make My Day, Movie Culture in the Age of Reagan. Jim is also the guest curator of our ongoing series of the same title, which features double bills, American films from the 80s, pairings of some of the films discussed in this book. We have the book for sale, as you can see, and Jim will be signing copies after our talk. The series runs through next Tuesday, so many more films. This is one of our double feature series for the summer, so it's 2-for-1 pricing. So let's start, Jim. Yeah. Thank you so much for putting the series together for us and for being here.
Well, thank you for hosting it, and also for using the double feature format.
Yeah, no, we've been doing that a lot this summer, and I know you're a fan of the double feature as a form, so we'll talk a little bit about that too. So the new book is I think interesting or significant in several ways. It's the concluding part of a trilogy. It's this culmination of the two books that preceded it with A Dream Life and Army of Phantoms. But I think it's also interesting that it's a fascinating companion piece to your 80s anthology, Vulgar Modernism, and I think unlike the two previous books in the trilogy, this covers a period during which you were actually a working critic. So I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about just how that informed your process, your approach, the way you thought about it, and also your research.
Well, in a way, it was the hardest book to write for me, because there's a certain incredible pleasure for me in revisiting the 60s in the dream life, since I was a young person then, a teenager, and that was just fun from beginning to end. And writing about the 50s was interesting in another way, because I was researching things that I didn't really live through, but it was happening while I was very young, and so that was a kind of archaeological dig. But going back to the 80s and reliving the Reagan period when I had already done this as a professional, presented certain problems, and I didn't exactly know how to go about it, because at first, because in the other versions, in the other two books, I leaned a lot on what contemporary critics had to say about these movies. What the response was to them, and in the 80s, I knew what the response was because I had a response, and so I had to figure out how to integrate myself into the book, which wouldn't have been my first impulse.
Right. So now that this is now 3 substantial books covering something like nearly half a century, 40. Yeah. When did you first did you know when you started that this was going to be this decade-spanning project?
Well, not exactly, but when I was an undergraduate, I read From Caligari to Hitler, the Krakauer book, and it made a big impression on me. And this is probably in 1968, and I was thinking, it was around the time when I had this realization. I mean, thinking about that King Kong. Oh, this is a movie about slavery and imperialism. I mean, why hadn't I known that? I mean, that kind of thing. I was having this realization about American movies, and I thought, having read the Krakauer book, I thought, one could write a book, from Strangelove to Wallace or Reagan or worse, which ultimately happened. But so I sort of had this idea,
So Reagan was probably just
Reagan was the governor of California, but I knew about him because I had spent the summer of 1968 in Berkeley. Instead of going to Chicago, I went to Berkeley, which was much more fun. And going to the movies then, not cross Telegraph Avenue to go to the Telegraph Repertory Cinema, you had to sort of wade through an ongoing disturbance or right every single night. And I was sympathetic, certainly, but I didn't want to see the movies anyway. I developed a complete loathing for Reagan during this. I mean, just he and I took it very personally. I mean, he campaigned against students. I mean, that was his whole thing then, and so that's how Reagan. I thought that and he already wanted to be president. I mean, that was evident. So I think that's how he was in there. I mean, George Wallace was more of an immediate threat in 1968 than Reagan, but he had made his intentions known. And the interesting thing is, which this comes back to the introduction of the book, if you don't mind getting to that, is that in the spring or summer of 1969, there was a wonderful show at the Museum of Modern Art, curated by Lawrence Alloway, called Violent America. And it was just his view of sort of action films from the 50s and 60s. And I went to all of those because I was a student. I could, had time to go to the movies all day if I wanted to. And that's where I saw The Killers. And I had no idea that Reagan was in it, really. I went to see it because it was a Don Siegel film. And there was Reagan, and I knew that he had been in the movies, but I had never seen him in the movies. And if you've seen that movie, you know that he's fantastic. I mean, he's this, this sort of arch gangster. I mean, he slaps Angie Dickinson. He's just a terrible, terrible guy. And I had a very naive response to this. I mean, it didn't occur to me that he's acting. I mean, I thought, I said, why would he be in a movie that got him to play what he actually hoped to become? I mean, to me, it was like some kind of strange documentary. So that also that figured into this as well.
And that was his last role, right?
His last role, and I never got over that. I mean, to me, it seemed like, when he developed, I mean, there were all sorts of things when he went into politics. I mean, I understand that his voice was fantastic. I mean, that he had this radio voice, and that he could, if he wanted to, he could play this sort of endearing, grandfather, and people bought that. But to me, he was always the guy in The Killers, and it's like the Marlon Brando. It's like One-Eye Jacks. You may be a One-Eye Jack in this town, but I've seen the other side of your face, and that was The Killers.
You talk in I think it's in the introduction, you talk about this sort of dawning realization that Reagan is the protagonist of the entire trilogy. Can you sort of elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, originally, I mean, I started thinking about this book when Reagan was president in the 80s, and it came out of some courses I was teaching at NYU in the summer, which would be sort of seminars in contemporary cinema. So I was showing all these movies which I really disliked, but which I thought had a certain, were very now or very then. And so originally I wanted to just do one book that would sort of start in the 40s with Fort Apache and then work its way up to, I guess, Raiders of the Lost Ark or something like that. And it became apparent once I began working on it that it was just impossible to do this in one book. And so my editor at the time suggested that I just take one section. And of course, as as a writer, I mean, I always like to do the easiest stuff first. I mean, that's my philosophy. So I figured, I'll start with the 60s, and do the middle part. And Reagan figured in that, but it wasn't really until I did the 50s and then was facing the 80s that I realized he was always there. He was just always around. And there really isn't anybody else. I tried to think if there was anybody else in American showbiz who had that kind of trajectory. And maybe you'll point at people who I'm forgetting, but there seemed to be two. There was Frank Sinatra, who started in the 40s and just kept going into the 90s, and Jerry Lewis is the only other one. And Jerry Lewis, for what it's worth, was like the first of one of Reagan's Hollywood posse, his cronies, to visit him in the Oval Office, which, for what that's worth.
So this approach to reading popular cinema politically and ideologically, which you talk about Krakauer, so obviously it's something that has existed, but I feel like I think of you, and I think a lot of people think of you as the critic who sort of perfected it, who did it week in, week out at the Village Voice, and it also, I think, is a way of talking about both film and culture and politics today, and like looking at just the intersection seems so natural to us now, but there is a sense in I think it comes across in a book too that when you started doing it, maybe it wasn't so. Maybe people didn't think this was necessarily like the most interesting or relevant way to look at things.
Yeah. Well, certainly the political writers at The Voice hated it. I mean, I got a lot of, but that was The Voice. I mean, that there would be a lot of, it was a fractious place. And I should say, I mean, that's really very generous for you to say that. I mean, from my point of view, it was a sort of self-defense mechanism, because I had been the second string critic at The Voice behind Andrew Sarris, and I was very, very happy doing that because I got to review whatever I wanted to, and I made up my own beat, and there were all sorts of things that I was reviewing. And then, Andy fell ill, and I had to fill in for him for a certain amount of time, and I had to review certain big Hollywood movies, and I always thought that I would, if I could never be a daily critic for a newspaper, because I would lose my mind, if I had to review this stuff all the time. And even at The Voice, I continued to mix it up, but my way of dealing with these movies was to look at them, in a kind of political way. And also, it was sincere. I genuinely hated a lot of these films, and so, it gave me a chance to vent. And gradually I thought that the thing with Reagan was I had been writing about him. I went back when I was reading this book. I didn't realize that. I mean, I knew I had written something in The Voice in 1980, which had been turned down by High Times, believe it or not. They thought it was too scurrilous, to do a movie, an analysis of Reagan's movie career. But then I realized I had actually even done this before. In the mid-'70s, I published something in the Berkeley Barb, for which, I don't know if anybody knows, but for which nothing could be too scurrilous. And about Reagan and as a movie star. And this was a very unpopular way to analyze him. Seemed like people thought this was very frivolous. Political writers, how could, so simple. And they didn't, I think that they didn't understand, that I didn't fully understand. It's not that the point was that Reagan was an actor in the movies, although in my opinion, this was the high point of his life. I mean, this was my takeaway from the 2 crazy days I did doing research in the Reagan Library. That he and Nancy, this is nothing. I mean, being president was very nice, but nothing really was as good as being even a second-tier star in Hollywood. I mean, you can't, So it's not just that he was in the movies were in him. And I didn't fully realize that until I started working on this book. And that's what, if you want to call it, his political genius was, to be able, and that's why he's like the epitome of Hollywood, in my opinion, because he was able to like take that sense, which was sincere, I feel. I don't think he was cynical about that, and kind of sell it to the American people, get them, like one last time, to go to the movies with him. And so really the kind of analysis that was going on missed the point of Reagan. However, by 1988, after 8 years of Reagan, everybody got it. And so if looking at the coverage of the 1988 campaign, Dukakis versus Bush, I mean, just the New York Times sent Frank Rich and Maureen Dowd to cover this, and they both came out of entertainment journalism, because by that time it was completely, everybody got it. But initially there was all this pushback, that it seemed trivial to talk about Reagan as a former movie star, as if that didn't make him the best prepared politician in American history, at least in the 20th century.
So you talk about this book as like, not exactly film criticism, maybe more of like a history, a kind of history, like, but a cultural, political history. And I mean, I would recommend to people, Jim's anthologies as sort of, I think, really the representative of the criticism and like the kind of films that you championed over the years. But like in the films, the way you write about the films in this trilogy, I think it's a different kind of evaluation. And you've already alluded to this a couple of times. I think in this volume in particular, there are a lot of not very good films. And can you talk a little bit about the process of writing and revisiting these? I actually think we did a pretty good job of like culling some interesting work for the series.
Yeah.
So we're not showing like bad films in this series. They are films that I think hold up in fascinating ways. But there are a lot of films in here, and this was as you say, in some ways a pretty dismal period for the mainstream American cinema.
And it got worse, I think. But
well, this is the beginning of the end. One might say,
yeah. I think that for me, the 50s was still a period when there was a lot for me to discover in working on that. A lot of interesting movies. That's really like the end of classic Hollywood in a way, although it's changing. And the 60s, I mean, I can't be entirely objective because I was like, what do the French have? The age of movie going. I mean, I just, was seeing all kinds of things. But I do think that the late 60s and the early 70s, this period that has become somewhat fetishized, is fascinating because the system broke down and all kinds of things were possible. But by the 80s, it had really become atrophied in a way. It's not just the blockbusters. It's the absence of a kind of secondary or tertiary mode of filmmaking. I mean, throughout the 60s, you still had, the 50s and the 60s, you had great westerns. I mean, there were genres that were viable and that enabled people to produce very strong work, sort of below the, operating below the radar because not that much attention was being paid to them by the studio. I mean, westerns would make money no matter what. So you could really, so they could be really terrible or they could be kind of experimental. But by the 80s, that's not possible. So a lot of, Hollywood just isn't as rich. And what I learned as a critic, you really have to take what comes and make something out of it. Bring something to it. So that was my feeling about the 80s, and there were certainly some excellent movies that were made then, but it's not like you're being inundated with excellence.
And in rewatching some of these films, did your estimation of any of them change in significant ways, or?
In minor ways. I mean, the movies that I hated then, I still hate. I didn't change. There were movies that I was more.
You hated for ideological or aesthetic reasons, or?
Well, I can't really separate these things. No. I mean, I can say that to take one which I had this experience teaching this film in a hostile way and sort of like seeing these students some of them anyway, being like really stricken. I mean, something like Close Encounters of I'm not going to call that a badly made movie. It's it's extremely well made movie. It's a very clever movie, and it has a lot going for it. But I just hate the way that it was made, and hate the gist of it, and hate so many things about it. That I'm never going to be able to get beyond that. I mean, there are movies. I had this. Certainly, there were movies in the 50s and more in the 50s than in the 60s. But there were movies in the 50s that I found ideologically objectionable. Almost everything, I guess. But I still admired as movies. But in the 80s, that became harder to do. And then there were movies that just strike me as terrible movies. I mean, Top Gun to me is just like a terrible movie. I mean, And
Probably even has his defenders by now.
well, yes, because I know this whole thing vulgar, or like auteurism, and Ridley, Tony Scott. I know, but like I'm a moldy fig. I mean, to be, it's just like, I didn't go along with that. There are some things like The Running Man. I think that I appreciate more now than I did then. Salvador, I'm willing to cut, Oliver Stone a lot more slack in that movie because it was such a gutsy movie to make, I think. And at the time, it was, like I was saying, well, of course you should do this. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't like I was into giving, like additional credit for, why didn't you do more, Yeah. So there's that. But, and then there were movies that I loved Blue Velvet then and still now. The Jonathan Demme film, Something Wild, I think I overrated it then. But basically I didn't change my attitude too much. There were no like dazzling rediscoveries for me.
Yeah. You mentioned Close Encounters, and I always, especially, have always loved reading you on Spielberg. So one thing I love about the book is how he's a key supporting character who runs through a lot of it. Yeah.
Well, yeah. See, up until a point. I mean, then he's sort of. I think I drop him after Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which just was rock bottom. But and then something happened though, very interesting. Like Spielbergism, as I used to write about it, developed its own. There's something dialectical happened there. For example, Gremlins is a movie that I liked then, and I still like, because Joe Dante, who is a guy with a political perspective. I mean, in his movies, was able to be at once part of the Spielberg movement and also, satirize it somehow or subvert it at the same time. I was very impressed with that. And, and Spielberg himself liked the movie, which says something about him. I mean, maybe I didn't give him enough credit, as for being, a generous producer, that he would have gotten Gremlins when it's such a savage film in some ways. And I also think that the early James Cameron films, the Terminator and Aliens, pick up on something that's implicit in Spielberg Lucas. I mean, this kind of comic book filmmaking, which of course now is like the thing that I feel most thankful for, having lost my job as a film critic, that I never have to go to any of these movies or have an opinion about them and be able to distinguish the good ones from the bad ones. But Cameron initially, when he made these first movies, they're kind of Spielbergistic too, but with a different attitude. I mean, he was, doing this pop comic book stuff, but it was much screwier and much, kind of edgier, crazier. I mean, you can even say that that's true of The Fly, Cronenberg. Although I think that Cronenberg brings his own. He predates Spielberg in his interest in genres and so on. And to my mind, he's much, sort of more profound film thinker. But there is that aspect there too of using these genres in a way that was made viable by Spielberg Lucas.
So I think to come back to Reagan, were there, you already touched a little bit on this, I think, but were there certain things, certain insights, certain perspectives on him that emerged in the research, in the writing of the book? I mean, you obviously a figure who loomed large in a big part of your adult life and your professional life, but obviously there was a pretty intensive research process. You went to the Reagan Library, I assume, and
yeah, it's like a shrine. The Reagan Library. I don't know if anybody's ever. I mean, I guess it would be probably most interesting for an ethnographic kind of research. I mean, what I found out in this library, that I don't think that presidential libraries are there to help you learn things. I think they're actually there to keep you from ever learning anything. But what I did find out in the Reagan Library, which It is a shrine. It's on the top of a hill, and actually, I was there very soon after Nancy Reagan passed, and they're both buried there. And I had already, I had my ticket to California. I was going to be out there, and I was, dreading the fact that they were going to shut the library. That that it would somehow be in its period of mourning, and I wouldn't be able to do the research there. But it did work out. But there still were like incredible banks of flowers strewn around her grave and so on. And it's a little bit like Disneyland, because if you've ever been there, you know that there are these sort of encephalitic Disney creatures wandering around, like Mickey and Donald, and they want to engage, they want to talk to you. And it's the same thing in the Reagan Library. There are these minor people from his administration. They're just there hanging out. And if you're doing research, they'll want to talk. And nothing they could say. I mean, I did talk to a guy who had been, I don't think he was the ambassador to the Soviet Union, but he was somewhere up there. And I did try and have a conversation with him. You can't really find anything out. First of all, he was elderly, and it's not like he, was remembered. But he did tell me one thing which was really great, which I then got verified. I asked him, well, when Reagan, met Gorbachev, did he want to see any movies? Did you show him any Soviet movies? He said, no, but they put together like a Gorbachev clip reel to show him, which I thought was interesting. So he could watch Gorbachev in the movies. And then I said, well, did you ever see any movies with him? And he said, no, they didn't like to watch movies with people. And this was really fascinating to me. This was a key thing, that Ronnie and Nancy would spend almost every weekend when they could at Camp David, and they would program movies. And I'm sure they picked the movies out themselves. I mean, who could program for them? They were of that realm. They were Hollywood people. And they knew what they wanted to see. And they would watch the movies together, like eating popcorn, and their staff would sort of be there, around them. But they did not use these movies as a social occasion, as other presidents have done. And so, for this reason, I found his movie-going fascinating to track. And you can. It's all, you can find every movie that he saw. Maybe. I mean, maybe some things that he left out. And he would sometimes make notes on them. Never as much that I always would have wanted more. I mean, I would have loved to have known what he thought about these things, because they were looking at movies in a way that no other presidential couple ever could have. And it's not just that their friends were in them or that they were in them. They understood something about them. They were professional. The other thing that I took away from it was, this goes into what I said before about it being like the sort of the high point of their lives. I mean, they were members of the Academy. They stayed in the Academy. They kept up with all the, mainly like the Warner Brothers stars. He kept up with them. They sent them birthday telegrams. He would call them sometimes. I mean, they felt part of that community, and they didn't, lose that. And people sometimes say, oh, Reagan, all he wanted to do was talk about his old movies. But, I began to understand why he would want to do that. I mean, that was his way of apprehending the world. When he saw something, I mean, a funny one is they did have a kind of a state screening for E.T., with the cast and crew, and all these people, Spielberg and, there. And the next day, he took a meeting with NASA. It's like he saw a movie about extraterrestrials and he wanted to find out some more about it. I mean, when he saw the movie Das Boot, the German submarine film, which was like the very, very successful movie, probably was the most successful German movie maybe ever, certainly at that time. It made him think. He wrote in his diary, he said how strange it was to see a movie and to sort of empathize with with your enemies. It's laughable, but it's also really profound that's how he got that. He looked at a movie, the movie moved him, it manipulated him emotionally, and something happened. And I'm convinced that this is what, this is the roots of Bitburg. I mean, he saw, somehow these Germans as and also what was I think it was Cole, did him a super amount of favors. So there was a big favor bank there. And the other thing I'll say is that, and this is very hard for me to say because I hated Reagan so much, and still I think that I saw the Roy Cohn documentary and I figured I was much too nice to Reagan. Just looking at all these characters, but the movie that maybe some of you remember, The Day After. The nuclear, sort of the ultimate disaster film, was a made-for-television shown in 1983. The administration took that very, very seriously. They regarded that as a political act, and they were really afraid of the Freezniks, as they called them, and not getting to have the cruise missiles or whatever I forget which missiles in Europe and so on. And Reagan saw it, and it actually made an impression on him. I mean, again, he saw, like a movie about the end of the world, and, he sort of thought about that, but in these crazy, sort of like fundamentalist terms, but here he saw a practical movie at the end of the world, and it impressed him. And I think that had something to do with, despite the fact that he was like ramping up the Cold War, and being at a war, as his willingness to negotiate with Gorbachev.
To come back to something you mentioned, I think this is actually really one of the most fascinating aspects of the book, is how you focus not just on movie culture in the Reagan era, but Reagan as a movie viewer is I think such a rich and productive sort of strand in the book. But how this is all sort of arranged along this timeline, and which you intersperse with events in his life and world events, and you already touched on a few things where there was just these startling maybe realizations of what he was actually watching and what was going on in the world around him. And of course, we were not aware of that at the time. So were there other things? There are a few things I remember, that he watched The Fan.
Yeah,
it's also
who can explain
really
that?
Strange.
Yeah, he watched The Fan. He watched Being There. Being There is the first movie he sees after he survives an assassination attempt. I mean, whose idea was that? And The Fan is even more incredible. But the Fan is I guess that was too trashy to show. Who knows if it even still exists? But The Fan, in case you forgot, is a movie starred Lauren Bacall is a star who's being plagued by a hostile stalker, like the nightmare stalker who actually wants to kill her. And the book was found when the FBI searched John Hinckley's room after they brought him into custody. They found that book. He had read that book, and then it was turned into a movie, and the studio, I forget which one it was so nervous about this because they, of course, associated it with, not with Hinckley, but with Chapman, the guy who killed John Lennon. And so they came up with some sort of trailer to kind of distance themselves from it. Anyway, it was probably, I can't remember, they're kind of a trashy movie. I know that the Reagans did not like disturbing films. I mean, he was afraid of showing Bronco Billy because Clint Eastwood dies at the end, and Nancy had just lost her father, and so he thought this would be too upsetting, to have a movie where Clint died. So they're looking at this trashy movie, where about somebody who's trying to assassinate, a celebrity, and they probably hated Lauren Bacall. I mean, politically, she would not have been, on their side, but. I don't know. It's just a mystery. And that's, I feel, why wasn't somebody taking notes? Because they would have said something. They would talk about these movies. It's not like they watched them in silence and then, went back to their cabin in Camp David. They talked about them.
Let's talk a little bit about the series and sort of your decision to sort of the selection that you made, and also the idea of pairing them. Maybe we can talk about one pairing that has proved, I think, especially popular and people are really interested in this, and I think it's the one that's selling the best and people are talking about it the most, is The Last Temptation of Christ and They Live.
Okay. That's kind of a conceptual pairing, and I would say it was like my request, your decision, to, but for which I thank you. But the short. I mean, my thinking about double bills is that I when I was reviewing, I love to review 2 movies at a time to find a good combination. And teaching, when I could, I like to show double bills, sometimes by superimposing the movies, actually, when I could get away with that. But because I felt that it's not exactly like it's automatic writing, but it's very stimulating to have 2 movies. It's like they talk to each other. They make you see, you can intuit certain connections, and then you can really see connections when you see them together. I don't know if that's dialectical. I don't know. I'm not exactly sure, but it's certainly an enriching way, I think, to experience movies. And of course, it was something that was done. It's a commercial decision that was made during the 1930s in the Depression, to get people more for their money, and I'm always for that. So with the 2 movies that you mentioned, I mean, first of all, they're coming at the end, and I felt that to start with, that The Last Temptation of Christ, as I said, was like a sort of look into the future. I mean, this is something that really began to happen in the 90s with Clinton, this really virulent culture war, but it sort of erupted then. And so I thought that was significant, and it's the end of Reagan's term. And there was an attempt to link Dukakis among some of these evangelicals, to link him to The Last Temptation of, to get this, somehow bring it all together, So, I mean, it did have that political thing. And then the John Carpenter movie, which actually is in theaters when Bush is elected president, and there's no missing the point of that movie. I mean, it was so satisfying for me as a critic to have that movie to write about. I mean, this thing just came out of Hollywood, so utterly unambiguous in its attack on Reagan and Reaganism, and it was very popular its first week. It actually was the #1 movie, and then after the election, it just disappeared. After Bush was elected, it just vanished. But like showing them together, I see that there's a whole religious thing that's going on in They Live, and that works. But it was my main reason was that they are. One's anticipating what's going to come. One is sort of looking back when it's kind of too late to have done anything about it. And, they both have their supernatural elements.
I'm going to ask you a couple more questions, and then we can open it up to the audience. One thing that is sort of hard to not think about as you're reading the book is the present day, which is something you touch on only very briefly, I think, at the very end of the book. But this is a book about the relationship between entertainment and politics. It's a book about a president who comes from popular culture. So it's really, there's a specter over this.
Yeah.
You started writing this before.
Well, I think it was during the end of Obama's first term is when I actually started writing this. Although it took me forever because I had to make the chronologies are the hardest thing. Yeah. But certainly I was doing most of the writing while Obama was president, and the end after the 2016 election. And so I certainly was thinking about Trump a lot while I was finishing the book. I have to say that I personally did not see Trump coming, and I blame that on 2 things. One, I blame it on the Village Voice because, in my world, in my bubble. I mean,
Anybody who read The Village Voice.
that's
would
right.
know.
I mean, Trump was, like this grotesque creature, like a con man and a blowhard and always going bankrupt, and I mean, just, it just was so evident, that what this guy was. And I recommend to you, if you want to cry, read Wayne Barrett's book on Trump. I mean, it's heartbreaking. You have to think that if the rest of America was reading The Voice, this never would have happened. But so I blame The Voice, for that. And the other thing is that I never saw the Apprentice or the Celebrity Apprentice. I had no idea. I mean, my idea of Trump was this guy, this character in The Voice. And so I had no notion of how America would have seen him. And so consequently, I was caught completely by surprise. I mean, as soon as Trump was there, I was like right away, like figuring out like how is this, like connected to Reagan and so on. And I wrote some things about it, which then got incorporated into the end. And when I think about my ideas like a 19-year-old, from Caligari to Wallace or Reagan or worse, that we did get something worse. Reagan was Hollywood, and there's a lot of negative things about that. But one could say that the basic, that Hollywood believed in happy endings, believed in sort of bringing together disparate groups of people, however imperfectly. They did that. There was a kind of desire to make a consensus, and there were these things which, however simple-minded, were integral to Reagan's view, and he was cheerful, and Trump, who is post-Hollywood, has none of that, and it's not just that Trump comes out of reality TV and out of the internet. I mean, these other things that are around there. It's his whole mindset. For any other president, 40% approval rating would be pretty terrible. But Trump understands ratings. A 40% Nielsen rating is fantastic. So. And it's funny, and it's probably stupid that he sees it that way, but he's not wrong. He understands something about show business, and it's that he's a showman, and I don't know, Dennis. It's just it's the whole thing is so painful, but that's what I put in what I thought in the at the end of the book, dealing with Trump, and also dealing with the fact that Reagan was much more popular in the 90s than he was leaving the presidency. I mean, people liked him personally, but he wasn't really regarded as this, the second coming of Franklin Roosevelt or Abraham Lincoln or anything like that. I mean, he was rated about as well as Jimmy Carter, and actually the first Bush, people thought more highly of in some respects. It's the 90s when Clinton kind of is also the avatar of Trump too, I must say, in like bringing together show business and politics in this other way, in this very tawdry fashion, when all news is really entertainment, which wasn't true with Reagan. Trump, Trumpism develops, and anyway, that's so I have to end the book on kind of a down note, I realize.
Yeah. I don't know that I have optimistic questions, but I guess another way to put that question is, the what you think about as you read the book is also what has changed since. And I think the reason your approach works so well for these books is because movies were central. You could read movies as like some kind of like collective unconscious. And I don't know. I wonder, could you have written this book about the Clinton. Yours? Could you, I mean, Trump. I mean, I don't even know.
No,
if
I
there's
wouldn't. I
any-
wouldn't have wanted to. I mean, there is a collection of my stuff, the Magic Hour from the '90s, which does deal with the Clinton period and movies. But no, I wouldn't have wanted to write a whole book. But I really just wanted to focus on the Cold War, and then I realized that Reagan, when he ends that, or when it ends, and he's a player in the end of the Cold War, since he doesn't really end it. That a lot of things ended along with it, and one of them was the centrality that Hollywood had. Something that I would say that I thought of actually, I didn't think of this while writing the book, but I learned this from watching a double bill. This was the double bill of The King of Comedy and Videodrome, two movies which I really like a lot, and thought were really just very smart movies. And there's something that occurs to me whenever I see an old movie and I see a phone booth in it, and I'm thinking, what do people think of this now? I mean, this is something that, I mean, phone booth. It's really like worse even than when you look at those '30s movies and they're like talking to the phone has to like the handle stuff. Like, phone booth, what is that? And so a lot of these movies, from the '80s, I mean, they're so old, they're so dated in terms of the technology. But Videodrome and The King of Comedy seem to me to be like absolutely current. I mean, the fact that they're about television, but they could just as easily be about the internet. They really could be. They have not lost anything, and I found that remarkable that these filmmakers could be so prescient, or they could tap into something which had not yet blossomed, but which would, some decades later.
Yeah, I mean, even Trump has a medium, right? So it's not cinema, but I think it's the point is that it's always been about mastering a medium.
Yeah. His star on Hollywood Boulevard, not
Wow. All right, so I think we have time for a few questions, and we have a microphone. So let's start over here.
I'm curious if there's a film that you would have screened for Reagan, given that he was apparently so susceptible to them.
That is a very good question. I'm trying to think. It's funny. I noticed that he did look at The King of Comedy, probably because his pal Jerry Lewis was in it. But would have been interesting to watch Videodrome with him, I think. I mean, he didn't like harsh movies. I mean, I don't think that he liked Arnold Schwarzenegger personally, but I don't think he ever watched any of his movies. And, he probably was unwilling to watch Stallone's movies. But he did look at things like, what is that Sidney Lumet movie? No. He might have looked at that, but he did look at, it's not Running on Empty. He looked on Running on Empty. I would have been curious to see, know what he thought of that. He had his own sense of like parent-children, 60s and things. But I don't know what I would have shown him. I don't know if I could have, frankly, I don't think I could have related to him. I mean, I was an undergraduate at the State University of New York when Nelson Rockefeller was the governor, and he came to the campus for some reason, and he was glad-handing the students, and he was shaking hands with people, and he wanted to shake hands with my girlfriend, and she just like turned away. She wouldn't shake hands with him, and I was always very proud of her for that. And so that's the,
Do you know if Reagan ever discussed movies in his letters? If his old cronies and
that is an interesting, thing. I'm not. Did he write letters? I mean, I don't know for sure.
Oh yeah, and I think there is a collection of them.
Well, then there's nothing in that collection that I'm aware of.
But you would think
I
he'd
think he
talk
would
to
use
Jerry
it.
Lewis about what he's watching.
No, I think that he would call them up. I mean, they would call, they would schmooze on the phone. I think that would have been more likely rather than, I mean, a letter, he sent a congratulatory, telegram, or have somebody write write a letter. I think that he was more, would have talked. That's my sense of it. He did talk to people. Did talk to Clint. Saw, they screened one of his movies, Firefox, for example, and they did have a 20-minute phone conversation. And actually, then the Army got it. Firefox, if you've ever seen it, it's the most insane movie. The Russians have come up with a kind of, jet bomber that works on mental telepathy or something like that, and they have to the Army has to send like the one, jet pilot who's fluent in Russian, parachute them into Moscow to like steal this, and it's Clint Eastwood. And so the Army then did get interested in some kind of like strange, it wasn't mental telepathy, but some kind of weird way of, brainwaves. I don't know exactly, but, it was after he saw the movie. So anyway,
I have a question that goes away from Reagan.
Good.
But I'm interested that he and his wife watched alone. And now we can stream movies and we watch movies alone. So how important is it, do you think, to watch movies with a group of people as opposed to solo?
Well, definitely it's different to watch movies with an audience. I mean, there's no question about that. I mean, people have been able to watch movies in their home, for since the early 80s, with VCRs. So I don't know that streaming is any different. I mean, the thing that's different is that you can watch it on your phone, I guess. But the Reagans they didn't watch it. It wasn't just the two of them. It was them and their courtier. I mean, I don't know how else to explain, their entourage. Thank you. Their entourage. It's the adoring crowd. I mean, it was very safe. I mean, Nancy did have a pal whose name I'm forgetting now. An interior designer from Beverly Hills, who was there an awful lot, and was probably a big movie fan, and they probably liked to dish, and the whole thing. But I think that I don't know that that streaming would have made any difference to them. They did have a VCR. Jack Valenti sent them one. So that they, like a high-end VCR, so that they could watch, and we don't know what they watched necessarily on that, because he didn't always put that down in his diary.
I have a quick question. Thank you for the very informative talk, by the way. In Back to the Future, when the film starts, it seems like the main focus is on Marty trying to change his family life, and he has this, it's really not that bad of a life, but they make it seem like it is, like it's something that needs to change. Like he has a crappy car, and by the end he needs to have a nice, shiny new truck, and his parents are miserable and fighting and everything like that. But in reality, most of our lives are like that, and we don't have a time machine at our disposal to change the parts of our life that we don't like, but he does, So I was sort of wondering, is the real nuclear nightmare of the 80s actually the family? And why is Reagan so focused on the concept of the family as opposed to, trying to end the war? Like you mentioned, eventually he gets more interested in ending the Cold War, but that seems to be based off of something that he watched in the movies. So I was just wondering about that sort of distinction there.
Well, I mean, Reagan's family was basically him and his second wife, Nancy. It doesn't seem like anything now, but Reagan was the first, divorced, president, and that had been a big deal. I mean, he had two adopted children with his first wife, Jane Wyman, who, sometimes he couldn't even recognize. It's really kind of pathetic. I mean, he had to, one of the boys, Michael Reagan, had to remind him, who he was at some function. And he had some kind of relationship with his two children, with Nancy, although I think she was, more hands-on as a parent. So he's no model of, family values, at least as they were imagined. But that doesn't matter because he was into these things as they are imagined. I mean, there were many ways in which he was contradictory. He didn't go to church all that much. I mean, he didn't love small town life. He left and went to Hollywood, like the flesh pots of Hollywood, the first opportunity. I mean, he loved it there. So back to the few. If he was talking about family values and so on, that's really like a political thing. And I think that Back to the Future is it's not so much that. Not only that the family is problematic, it's that that things seemed like like they would have been so much better somehow in the 50s, and if that could be played forward into the 80s, that would improve his life and everybody's life. And I think that that's kind of a trope in 80s movies, the sort of superimposition of the 50s over the 80s, or the glamorization of the 50s. I'm not sure if this is answering your question, but that's what I think is going on there.
Do you think 10 years from now we'll be able to say that the current film output is reflecting our times, or is it become too much about mass consumer product?
Well, I think that there's always going to be all movies are about their own time. I mean, I think that's the simplest thing to say, there are no there's no such thing really as a period film. And without going into too deeply, I mean, I think that a lot of people realize that Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is about 2019, at least as much as it's about 1969. The real question is whether these movies will amount to much. I mean, they just may be footnotes, and the really lasting culture will be about something else. I mean, I can say that I do not plan to write any more books like this. So, but I'm just speaking for myself.
All right, since we have two hands, we'll take both your questions and then we'll wrap up.
I've noticed in some of the films in the series that there are characters who are kind of these wandering types, or I don't want to say homeless, but kind of aimlessness, like Jeff Bridges' character in Carter's Way, or Pee Wee Herman in Pee-wee's Big Adventure, or even Marty McFly. I don't know. I don't know if you talked about this in your book, but could you speak to that a little bit, maybe?
Well, I think that not Marty McFly so much, but the characters in Carter's Way, and also Pee-wee, and also the characters in River's Edge and maybe are fringe figures, and that makes them, by their very nature, they're outside of the hegemony which was advanced by most 80s films. They're critical. It's critical in some way. I mean, Pee-wee is a fascinating manifestation of the time. I mean, I actually think that his TV show is. I mean, I don't want to scare anybody away from the movie, which is very interesting. But I think that the TV show is, to me, much more culturally significant, and that it's up there with Blue Velvet, and also I talk about Watchmen, the graphic novel. I see these things as like really great examples of a kind of dissident culture that sort of developed in spite of itself, in the mass media in the 80s. But whenever somebody's on the margins, they're outside of like the great New Morning in America, and would be significant for that reason.
I want to thank you for your courage to tell it like it really was. I was a student at Berkeley in the 60s, was tear gassed by a military helicopter that he sent while we were peacefully demonstrating, surrounded constantly every single day by the National Guard, and he would go on TV every single night and act like he was your grandfather and lie like a rug. And the press did not hold him accountable. He would lie. I mean, the day James Rector was shot and blinded and eventually died, he said, "Oh, today was just another peaceful day on campus." And nobody called him on it. Nobody.
He also said, if there's going to be a bloodbath, let's get it over with.
Oh, no, yeah. I call them the murderers. I won't.
Yeah.
I don't call them by name. I won't say
Yeah.
their names out loud.
Yeah.
They didn't say the word AIDS for 8 years.
Yeah.
They took away all the funding for HIV research and help, and I won't fly into the airport either.
Yeah.
All right. I think we'll end on that note. So, thanks. But